Hello, my friends. Today is May 31st, and this is Markets Weekly. So, this past week was a shortened holiday trading week, but man, it was totally packed with excitement. And it all began even before markets opened Tuesday morning. Now, over the long weekend, President von der Leyen of the European Union called President Trump, and together they worked out some kind of temporary truce when it comes to trade. Now, remember, last week, President Trump told the world that he would impose a 50% tariff on the EU because he was not happy with trade progress. So, over the weekend, they managed to delay the implementation of that tariff to several weeks beyond the initial deadline, all the way until July 9th, giving the EU and the US plenty of time to work something out. Now, the markets really liked that news and totally surged. Now, later on in the week, the markets got another positive piece of news on the trade front. A US trade court basically said no to President Trump's reciprocal tariffs, and the markets surged again on that, although notably faded. So this week was all about trade talk news. So today let's talk about that legal ruling and why, that's really never going to matter in this context. So there will be tariffs. And secondly, why, based on the things that we're seeing, trade talks really are not going well, and maybe the president is going to have to do something drastic. Okay, starting with the legal ruling. So, Congress has power over tariffs and stuff like that, but a few decades ago, they delegated it to the president. And the president, again, doesn't make the law, executes the law, has a wide range of tools through which he can use trade policy. So, for example, he can do something called a Section 232 tariff, where they do a long couple months study, maybe more, on a particular sector, and finding that study through that study that foreign countries are not behaving well in the trade, they can do something about it. Now, the Section 232 tariffs rolled out in aluminum, steel, autos, and that's the basis for those tariffs. However, another tool the president has is something called IEPA. So in that case, the president can declare an emergency, and the president has a lot of leeway, a lot of discretion to declare an emergency. And once we're in a state of emergency, he can use all these tariff powers. Now, some people obviously are not happy with the tariffs, challenge them, and the U.S. Trade Court is saying that, this reciprocal tariff stuff, IEPA powers, this doesn't make sense, and so no. Now, the president was obviously they're upset about this, appealed, and also talking about all sorts of other things they can do about it. Now, there've been many smart people who are saying that, this tariff thing, it's going to blow over because the courts will find it to be illegal and it will be game over. But, I really think that misunderstands on a very fundamental way just how the world works and the era that we're in. Now, I think to better understand this, we should have some more historical context. So I want to talk about a couple US presidents that are very similar to Trump and also had clashes with the courts. So let's talk a little bit about Andrew Jackson, President Andrew Jackson, who was president during the 1820s, and President Roosevelt, who was president during the 1930s. So President Jackson was someone who was basically a populist, and by populist I mean someone who drew his movement from people who are maybe lower income, less educated.
We won with poorly educated. I love the poorly educated.
And he identified with people who were basically common men. And he would rail against the elites, the educated people, the wealthy people in the big cities and so forth. And his presidency came at a time when there was great change in the world. The big change from a suffrage point of view was that in the beginning, in the US, the only people who could vote were people who were basically men who owned land. Now, during the few years, couple of decades preceding Andrew Jackson's presidency, that was being reformed such that all men could vote. And so suddenly you had a huge change in the composition of the electorate, whereas you had all these people who were not landowners and suddenly they could vote. And these guys obviously were less well off, and you can think of them as the common man. And so Andrew Jackson appealed to those people and fashioned himself as a populist, and he himself was from very humble origins, though, of course, a war hero, and ultimately did become wealthy. So he would, some of the things that he would do was that he would have these mass rallies, and he would make them to be festive events where people would come. It would be pretty chaotic, but you'd have barbecue, you'd have alcohol, honestly, just like a Trump rally. And his people would just be the people that honestly were not very high status people. And his signature policies that we remember from all this time were things like getting rid of the central bank. Now, before we had the Federal Reserve, we had the Bank of the United States. Now, Andrew Jackson was like, this bank there, secretive organization, helping rich people with using funny money and all that, that's not good. So I want to destroy it. And so Andrew Jackson really tried very hard and did destroy the Bank of the United States. Now, when he's doing all these changes, obviously, there's going to be a lot of backlash. There are people who have entrenched interests and so forth, and so that made him unpopular with some parts of the public. Now, one of his most memorable things was his defiance of the Supreme Court. Now, back then, the United States was smaller than it is today, and there was a lot of Cherokee land, so Indian land, that was sprinkled out in the U.S. Now, the state of Georgia basically tried to take over some of the Indian land and give it to their own people. Now, the Supreme Court ruled against that and said that that's illegal by treaties and so forth. That land is belongs to the Indian land, and the Supreme Court was totally correct on that. Now, that being said, President Jackson saw that ruling and memorably, again, we don't know if he actually said this, but said something to the extent that, well, Chief Justice Marshall, you made this ruling, why don't you go enforce it yourself, right? But of course, the justice system doesn't have an army, doesn't have a police force, really can't do anything about it. And so what actually happened was that the Indians were forcibly removed from their lands, and it was actually an event called the Trail of Tears, which was very sad, and they all were forcibly removed from their lands and moved farther westward to Oklahoma, and that land was given to other people. So here is a president of the United States just defying the Supreme Court, and that happened. Why? Because President Jackson, super popular. And when you are the government, your power derives not from what some random guy says far away in Washington, D.C., but by popular support, and President Jackson understood that. Now, secondly, let's talk about President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was president during the 1930s. Now, at that time, as we all know, it was the Great Depression. Unemployment rate was as high as 25%. It was a time of great misery. Now, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was also a populist, and his source of support was what he would call the forgotten man. So basically, all these people who were, suffering, ordinary people, and he would, harness their support against the elites. And so what he was trying to do was he was trying to embark upon a very large project of redistribution. And so it was during this era where he massively raised income tax, massively even creating what many thought then as a wealth tax, and then took that money and built all sorts of public works programs and things like Social Security and so forth. And so he was basically fundamentally changing how the system worked. Now, the Supreme Court of that time was not supportive of his actions, basically saying that what he was doing was illegal. And to be clear, they were totally correct. Now, the United States initially was built on on the belief of a small government. So you would have a federal government, and you would also have state and local governments. Now, since the beginning, the federal government was actually supposed to be a very weak political entity, and the power was supposed to largely reside within the states. In fact, in that era, when they tried to pass laws to mandate seatbelts for cars, they couldn't do that because it was ruled that the federal government did not have the power to mandate seatbelts for the country. So the federal government at that time was not powerful, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt was basically remaking the system to make the federal government powerful as a way to as a way to meet the emergencies of that time. And he was very astute in that he would every week engage in these weekly fireside chats using, again, radios, which was a new technology at that time, to build a relationship with the public, to let them know what they were doing, and of course, to earn their trust and support. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt obviously was popular among the public, but again, among the elite, again, he was not popular because, of course, he was threatening their interests. Now, to be clear, FDR himself was born from a very wealthy family, and this elite persona, this populist persona, maybe was just manufactured. I don't know. But again, you can see parallels today with President Trump, who, despite being a populist, identifying with the working class, blue collar people, is a billionaire, and of course, very adept at using new media like Twitter. So when FDR was doing all these big changes, obviously people weren't unhappy, and the Supreme Court was threatening to put an end to it. And so what did FDR do? Well, he was like, well, Supreme Court, okay. Well, you guys are voting against me. Okay, how many justices do you have there? Okay, how about I, add some more justices, put my own people on the court. In fact, I'll keep putting people on my court until we get enough votes to pass. How about that? And that is obviously a significant constitutional crisis, and that was really impact his political capital. But the end result was that the Supreme Court backed down and allowed his programs to proceed and allowed him to fundamentally remake the American government. Now, I say these two examples because I think of Trump as very much another person who is trying to remake the global world order. Now, this happens every now and then. The U.S. is a very dynamic political system. But President Trump is identifying with the common man, many who feel that things are not going well, and he's challenging the current elite, economic interests, and so forth, and he's trying to remake the world. Right now, what we're seeing, for example, is that he is systematically trying to dismantle Harvard University, one of the, actually, probably the most prestigious university in the entire world, cutting their funding and trying to mess with their admissions process and so forth. And what really surprises me is that no one is standing up and trying to defend Harvard. You have this bastion of the elite, and no one is standing up to them. And I think this is consistent with what we see throughout polling, is that the broader public does not have as much confidence in our institutions as they did in the past. And so they are okay with them being dismantled or changed, and kind of how President Trump came to power to begin with. Now, President Trump being a populist president at a time when the institutions are weak, at a time when, he has, did win an election. So I'd say brought popular support. Again, there are many people who don't like him, but there's also, I think, at least 20% of the people who think of him as the great leader. So a court, basically just three guys in DC, is not going to be able to change this entire movement. The president has the support of tens of millions of people. He's on TV all the time. Everyone knows. And of course, many people perceive the court system to be unfair. So these court rulings are just not going to be able to change presidential policy. The government itself is not super bound by the law. The government creates and enforces the law. So if you're looking at the law, the legal system, to kind of change the executive, that's just not going to work in an era of populism. And if the courts do that, the courts, again, ultimately, it's just a few people without an army, unelected. Their power derives from the consent of the people, and they're not going to be able to win. And so that's why the court in FDR's time bent the knee, and that's why any court in this era will have to do the same. So in any case, we probably won't have to get to that extent. The president has, acknowledge that there's a lot of other ways to do this, right? If you look through the existing law, there are current laws where they can impose tariffs of up to 15% for 90 days, and during that period, just roll out new Section 232 studies that eventually lead to tariffs and so forth. But there's a lot of tools for them to be able to do this. But I think looking to the legal system to try to stop this tariff policy, that's just not going to happen. Yeah, the law it's not some magic incantation. It really derives its legitimacy from the public, and the public have for decades been looking for change. Now, maybe not particularly on tariffs, but still, I think most people give the president the benefit of the doubt. So I would expect tariffs to continue, and this stuff is just going to be how it is, at least until we get a new president. Okay, the second thing that I want to talk about is trade talks. Now, trade talks have not been going well by obviously, right? So I think the biggest hint you can get from this is from Secretary Bessent himself, who said this.
And what about China, specifically China, and that obviously started in a different place? How can you characterize those talks now?
I would say that they are a bit stalled. I believe that we will be having more talks with them in the next few weeks, and I believe we may at some point have a call between the president and party chair Xi.
So basically, that's the sitting Secretary of Treasury acknowledging that trade talks with China are not going well. Now, this is really surprising because if you notice everyone else in the administration, when you're part of the administration, you're on the same team and you got to say good things about the president. Everything's going well, And that's what they all say. So when one of them says something different, that's a huge red flag. And that suggests that things are actually going really, really poorly. Now, Bessent himself, I note that is a particularly honest person. I remember that at Liberation Day, when he was asked why the president did not have Canada and Mexico on his big, poster of reciprocal tariffs, the secretary said, "I don't know." That was surprising to me because no one wants to admit they don't know something on TV, and to admit that is kind of also saying that, I'm not that important. But he did that, and so that tells me he's someone honest, and so he's being honest again, saying that, we're stalling here on trade talks with China. Now, furthermore, on Friday, the president had a tweet complaining about trade talks with China, saying that, no more Mr. Nice Guy. Now, the reporting suggests that part of the agreement at Geneva was that the U.S. would roll back their tariffs, China roll back theirs, but also China would be able to expedite, or at least continue, rare earth shipments. But what seems to be happening is that the Chinese are slow walking their exporting on rare earths, and that's impacting businesses in America and making the administration mad. So we'll see what they're going to do. It looks like on Friday, they also rolled out new regulations saying that they're going to have more enforcement on certain Chinese tech mergers. And also throughout the week, the administration seems to be cracking down on visas for students from China. And that obviously is going to upset people in China. Now, the thinking from the administration seems to be that, China is our strategic competitor. It doesn't make sense for us to give university places to them, only for them to go back and, maybe work in areas that are at odds with the U.S. Why don't we give this to an American who will stay here and try to build out American industry? So that seems to be their thinking. Now, this is connected to, despite all this, I think it's noteworthy that the markets really didn't go down a lot. And I think that's connected to something else, that is the emergence of the taco trade, which stands for Trump always chickens out. Now, at a recent press conference, President Trump was actually asked about this. And I don't know, he probably doesn't follow Twitter the way that many of us do, but it seemed like it was his first time hearing this.
President, Wall Street analysts have coined a new term called the taco trade. They're saying Trump always chickens out on your tariff threats, and that's why markets are higher this week. What's your response to that?
I kick out?
Chicken out.
Oh, isn't that nice? Chicken out. I've never heard that. You mean?
And as we all know, Trump, over the past decade, would always make comments that, foreign leaders are laughing at us, they're thinking that we're stupid. And now I think what the press is saying that, Mr. President, the kids are laughing at you. They're saying that you always chicken out. So we're at this juncture where one is that, Trump is, giving more resistance from the courts about his tariffs. His trade partners are pushing back against him, and it seems like his tariff agenda, his trade agenda, is not going well. And of course, he is being humiliated. So it seems that my best guess is, looking at his temperament, he might have to do something just to show the world that he's not a chicken. Okay, so we'll see what that is. Again, this whole week was dominated by headlines. I would not be surprised if next week were to be the same. All right, talk to you guys next week.